of a disciplinarian
But
I am.
over here, blocking the entrance would be the way to, the place to naturally lecture from.
Yeah, we like the side exit, once to talk to the guys, tray tables and
Oh yeah, there it is.
seats up.
9.5 miles? I mean, 9.5 minutes per mile to 9.25.
I only get to review on lecture day.
It's true.
How's it going?
No, but you can read it.
How we doing?
Should we grab more chairs?
Yeah, let's get
I haven't stopped eating it.
install the TV dishes out there. Dave, are you going to sit roll or stand up?
I think I'm probably going to, well,
Yeah, I mean,
because
when we do
we're,
questions.
again, I'm kind of tethered.
You're tethered.
Well,
to
how
see
are
the
you?
pictures.
Good. Been a long time. I know. I said, Dave, I'm going to see what's going on in the new one.
All right.
Oh,
Here you go.
cool. Here comes Roger with the biggest chair in the department.
We might want to
You
slide
want to
it
slide
down.
it? You want to put
Never
it?
bring that back.
Candace.
Yes, ma'am.
Thursday's paper is what should be expected in previous consciousness.
Ah. What should we expect from you?
So is it in response or just something different? Are you a referring block?
Also, I talked to Jillian.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the potential therapy meter.
Oh cool, yeah.
She was on
So
board.
there's an empty chair in the
Yeah, she's
back.
great.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
One of the few that even know she wanted to do it. And
Yeah.
So,
Very understandable.
Yeah. No, I told you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think Julian would do great.
yeah, yeah, he was a TOT for audit.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Just get you.
This is why I chose not
Can I
to.
sit in?
Just gonna stay
So long as
here.
we have seats. Yeah. That was the only issue. Yeah. Because they were in North last year we were just doing comments
So
on
cramped.
funny big. I've not been in this classroom for North, and usually there's 45 students.
So let's get started. Welcome everyone to the last speaker series event for the philosophy department for the fall. I want to thank Rob Metcalf and Sarah Tyson for organizing it, and to Liz Puente Calderon and Andres Paladon for putting all the logistics together and for the food. So round of applause for the food. So today I'm happy to introduce to you Professor David Beisecker. Dave Beisecker. Dave is from UNLV in Las Vegas, and he's a past president of the Southwest Philosophical Society, and he's active in Mountain Plains Philosophy Association. That's how I know Candace. That's how I know you. How you know me. Dave works in the area of philosophy of mind and language, metaphysics, epistemology, and more recently, American philosophy. Dave's written on a wide variety of different topics, but my favorite are zombies. So some papers Dave's written on zombies include Nothing But Meat, Philosophical Zombies and Their Cinematic Counterparts, The Explanatory Gap from a Zombie's Point of View, and How to Talk Like a Zombie. So today, Dave will be talking like a zombie about logic, language, and the Pragmatic Maxim. He may or may not mention zombies in the talk, but please be aware that after the talk, Dave may attempt to eat our brains. So, fairly warned, he says
I'm on a 12-step program. There's a chip somewhere. I have a handout, and it's largely a bunch of passages we'll be talking through, that I plan to be talking through, largely from Peirce, so as that goes through. Thanks, Candace. Thanks, David, for having me out here. This is a great honor. You have a PKH Realty who sponsors these events. That is wonderful. Thank them for the food. So far, thank all of you for the wonderful hospitality. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time talking. I'm up here, tethered to the PowerPoint. The iPad here. my cutie. We're probably biting off a little bit more than we can chew. So we're going. It's an ambitious schedule today. We're going to have just a little refresher where I review various formulations of the Pragmatic Maxim, especially by Charles Saunders Peirce, and going to connect them to some themes in the philosophy of language, contemporary philosophy of language, relate them to a system of logical proof. Fortunately, it's a system of logical proof that many of you must have had from Mark. As far as I know, Mark is the only other person I have encountered to approach logic in this fashion. So you guys are way ahead of the game here. And then I'm going to wrap this up with a logical literary mystery reveal. Okay, and we're somewhere around here we'll see my girlfriend again. So think of this as your refresher course on pragmatism. Perhaps Pragmatism 101. This might be your most folks' first and only encounter with Charles Saunders Peirce. Hi, Chuck. We'll be seeing a lot of him in the future. And what we have here, it's the first one, the first passage on your handout. Basically, it's the germ of pragmatism. It comes out of his famous article, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, which I understand we read in David's pragmatism class. And so Peirce tells us, we come down to what is tangible and conceivably practical as the root of every real distinction of thought, no matter how subtle it may be. And there is no distinction of meaning so fine as to consist in anything but a possible difference of practice. Okay. Now that leads 400, paragraph 400, 2 paragraphs later, to his first articulation of the Pragmatic Maxim. And Peirce tells us, it appears then that the rule for attaining the third grade of clarity of apprehension is as follows. Consider what effects which might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have. Then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. And I'm sure that that passage was enshrined in David's pragmatism class. This is the original formulation. But I would like you to note that there are two strands of thought that are somewhat competing, that are both bound up in that original formulation. On the one hand, there is what you might think of as a verificationist strand of thought. That Peirce is articulating real clearly in the paragraph in between. I only desire to point out that how impossible it is that we should have an idea in our minds which relates to anything but conceived sensible effects of things. Our idea of anything is our idea of the thing's sensible effects. And so we have a thing here, and you might go, okay, what are the thing's sensible effects? Well, low, oblong, and green, and of course, if you're anything like me, irredeemably vile. That is proof that God really does hate me. So there's a verificationist strand, where the emphasis is on the sensible effects of things. At the same time, you have something that I call the conduct strand, where, again, same area. Peirce says, the essence of belief is the establishment of a habit, and different beliefs are distinguished by the different modes of action to which they, the beliefs, give rise. If beliefs do not differ in this respect, if they please the same doubt, well, blah, blah, blah. And so we have, in the conduct strand, we have, say, a belief that you might have. There's a cucumber over yonder, and then you are committed to perhaps asserting or affirming some other things. You are perhaps also committed to, depending on your proclivities, performing some sorts of actions. But among other things, you might be, if you are prepared to assert that there's a cucumber over yonder, you're also going to be prepared to defend at least the claim over there is an oblong green thing. And you might have something about, Greek salads and look at the internet, scaring cats, a good thing for cucumbers to do. And so when you put all of this together, the more complete picture of the pragmatic maxim is you have a thought. There's a cucumber. It commits you to some other affirmations that might be verified by the truth of, or the sensible effects of the thing to which you might be talking about. And then there are even further downstream effects here, having to do with, well, perhaps scaring cats, making pickles, and so on. But the point is, we have the conduct strand right here. We have the verification strand down here. And if you want to go to some of my philosophical heroes, we have Wilfrid Sellers would call this a language entry. And there is an intralinguistic move. Again, Wilfrid Sellers talks about language moves might oblige you to make other language moves. And then we have language exit moves, things you can do once you are committed to some sort of constellation of beliefs. And so we have the Salarzian picture right here, these various arrows. And we also have, if I want to give Dewey a shout out, and of course, David's in the room, I have to give Dewey a shout out too. As Dewey so emphasized, these various strands are reinforced by habit. That habit plays a great role in both informing and enforcing these strands. Okay, so that's the more complete picture. Now, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, and so I'm going to get to the board of the paper. The prevailing tendency, let me back up. The prevailing tendency among commentators of Peirce is to emphasize this, the verificationist strand. By that I mean people like Cheryl Misak, Susan Hack, Christopher Hookway. So they take this strand to be dominant over, in particular, this strand. I'm in a minority that would like to focus, for reasons some of you might know in my background, would like to focus on this strand. Okay, so I'm in the minority here. And predominantly, commentators emphasize this strand because they want to see Peirce mostly in the tradition of the philosophy of science and in a more general theory of inquiry and trying to articulate a scientific method. They also want to emphasize this strand because this strand looks a little more Jamesian, William James, and Peirce is, certainly Peirce commentators are clear to separate themselves off from the Jamesians. So the dominant move in, or the dominant theme amongst commentators emphasize this, de-emphasize this a little bit. James, remember, talks about the effects of having a belief. And so if we emphasize this, it sounds like you might be making Peirce into more of a will to believe kind of guy. But I want to focus on this. And I want to point out that against the grain of commentators, later in his career, Peirce himself emphasizes the conduct strain over the verification strain. So here I'm going to pair off two different later articulations of the pragmatic maxim. The first comes in 1902 from the Baldwin Dictionary of Philosophy and Psychology. So sort of pay attention to this quote. He says, "In order to ascertain the meaning of an intellectual conception, one should consider what practical consequences might conceivably result by necessity from the truth of that conception. And the sum of these consequences will constitute the entire meaning of the conception." So the idea, if you go back, you've got the cucumber there, that vile green thing, and the meaning of the conception of the cucumber is the conception of the cucumber's effects. This is 1902. This is 1905. And so we have Peirce, again, articulating the Pragmatic Maxim. And here he says, speaking about himself in the third person, endeavoring as a man of that type naturally would to formulate what he so approved, he framed the theory that a conception, rational purport of a word, lies exclusively in its conceivable bearing on the conduct of life, conduct strand. So that since obviously nothing that might not result from experiment can have direct bearing on the conduct, if one can define accurately all the conceivable phenomena which the affirmation or denial of a concept could imply, one will have therein a complete definition of the concept. And there is absolutely nothing more in it. And so what I want to point out, that the pairing here is, in the Baldwin Dictionary, meaning is to be understood you spell out the meaning of a claim by spelling out the consequences of the truth of a claim. Here, you spell out the meaning of a claim in terms of the consequences of affirming and denying that claim. Those two positions are completely different. One way of articulating this, something that would be familiar to Peirce, who is always in debt, I can attest that I have $1 million in my bank account. Now the consequences of my attesting that I have $1 million in my bank account is far different from the consequences of my actually having $1 million in my bank account. You catch the difference? Okay? There's consequences of my having $1 million. Lots of things I can do with that. But the attesting, it's not that it comes for free. Okay? You can hold me accountable, make me pay the check, if I so attest that I have $1 million in my bank account. But, again, attesting that I have $1 million is a far cry from making it the case or the consequences of its being the case. So, what do we want to say about this shift? First of all, I want to say that Peirce is evidently taking pragmatism and shifting from the consequences of the truth of a claim to the consequences of affirming a claim. Peirce is evidently taking pragmatism along a more linguistic turn. Okay? It is, among other things, it is much less psychologistic. So you think of the real distinction between Peirce and James is not so much that Peirce takes truth to factor into meaning and James only takes the effects of belief. It's that Peirce is shifting away from the consequences of believing to the consequences of affirming. Okay, so it's now we're shifting from just mere psychological states to the consequences of speech acts in our practices. I also want you to note that nowhere in this formulation, especially when you compare it to some of the earlier formulations, remember when Peirce says, the idea of a thing is exhausted by its sensible effects? No. Sensation doesn't appear in this formulation at all. So again, it's kind of anti-psychologistic of a different sort. It's anti-sensual. And, of course, it trades in truth for the speech acts of affirmation and denial. Okay. And one of the things you might notice, and here I'm going to give another shout out to our good guy Dewey. As Dewey points out, the range of things that you may affirm and deny is quite broader than the scope of things for which you might believe in on an antecedent truth. You can make promises, You make affirmations and thereby, so to speak, create new truths as opposed to just express a previous truth. And so what I'm, this quote here kind of suggests that Dewey too is thinking of meaning not just in terms, well, certainly not in terms of truth conditions where you think of truth conditions of an antecedent reality, but he has just a richer conception of the speech acts that you need to account for when you're thinking of the meaning of things. All right. Let's see where do I want to go through? Okay. Now, I think all this, the trading in of truth for affirmation, suggests that Peirce doesn't think that the notion of truth needs to play any essential role in his own theory of meaning at all. And here we might remind ourselves that Peirce only arrived at his own metaphysical account of truth, roughly as that which would be believed at the end of inquiry, only after he has put the pragmatic maxim in place in his account, and he's actually putting it to use. Okay, so what I'm suggesting here, far from being a fundamental aspect of pragmatism, an account of truth is on this view, but one of its offshoots, and perhaps an optional one at that. All right, the other thing that I want to point out is, not only does it seem that Peirce is moving away from a semantic theory built upon representational notions like truth, he is evidently moving towards a semantics that is aligned more closely with our habits and our self-controlled conduct. The consequences that matter for meaning are not just those upon our practical conduct, but they are also those that flow from such conduct. In this sense, the account expresses a more thoroughgoing pragmatism, I would argue, in which meaning is grounded not in truth, but rather in the speech acts of affirmation and denial. Instead of pragmatics being grafted onto semantics, semantics is now thoroughly rooted in pragmatics. All right. But the important thing is not how concepts correspond to an antecedent reality, which is not to say that they don't, but rather how they can be arranged together to form beliefs, the significance of which, in turn, is to be understood in terms of the actions and thoughts that those beliefs do or do not license and imply. As can be seen from the passage right here, meaning resides really wholly in what Peirce calls implication. So he says here, this is a later article in the same Monis 1905 series. The character, when people want to make their ideas clear, the character of their meaning consists in the implications and non-implications of their words, and they intend to fix what they intend to imply or not imply. Okay? And so what I want to point out here, probably this is Peirce's reply to James. This way of formulating the pragmatic maxim gives the maxim a much more normative twist. The consequences in question are not so much the causal consequences of the world's being a certain way, nor is it the causal consequences of your believing in a certain way, but rather the consequences that redound to a speaker or thinker in affirming a claim or denying it. In contemporary parlance, Peirce is moving toward an inferentialist semantics, according to which the meaning of a proposition is to be understood in terms of the networks of conclusions it licenses and the premises that license it. And so finally we get to the end of my Peirce primer. This is my favorite expression of the or articulation of the pragmatic maxim. It's a little long here, the whole quote. It comes from, again, that same era, 1904, 1905. The method prescribed in the pragmatic maxim is to trace out in the imagination the conceivable practical consequences, that is, consequences for deliberate self-controlled conduct, of, again, the affirmation or denial of the concept. And the assertion of the pragmatic maxim is that herein lies the whole of the purport of the word, the entire concept. And here's just an astonishing claim. The sedulous exclusion from this statement of all reference to sensation is specially to be remarked. And so, so you can see, wow, we have traveled very far from 1868, where he says our idea of a thing is exhausted by its sensible effects, to the sedulous exclusion from the statement of all reference to sensation is specially to be remarked. Yeah, what? All right. See, I'm getting lost. Oh, let's see what happens on the next page. Ah, yes. So, yes, it's coming. The thing I want to pull out, I mentioned this sedulous exclusion. I also again mentioned that here we are, Peirce's pragmatic maxim is now not focusing upon truth of a claim or even belief in a claim. It's focusing on affirmation or denial, speech acts. But there's another feature about this passage that I think has gone totally unremarked by commentators, and that is that Peirce has now moved from a single-barreled conception of the pragmatic maxim to what I now think of as a double-barreled or bilateral conception or articulation of the pragmatic maxim. So earlier it was just the consequences of a claim's being true. Now it's not just the consequences of a thing's being affirmed, a concept's being affirmed, but it's also the consequences of a thing's being denied as well. And so what I would urge us to think, one of the astonishing thing that I want to focus on for the rest of this paper is this double-barreled aspect of the articulation of the pragmatic maxim. It includes not just the consequences of affirmation, but the consequences of denial as well. And here, millennials probably don't know this one. So if you don't understand the reference, ask somebody older than you. So what I'm suggesting here is including the consequences of affirming a claim alongside the consequences of denying a claim. Peirce is now giving a very early expression of what is now being called bilateral semantics. A semantics in which you have to give, so to speak, the concept, well, it's going to sound just like that earlier expression of the pragmatic maxim. It's a semantics where you need to give the consequences of affirming a claim and the consequences of denying it. And specifically, the denial is not to be understood simply as the assertion of a negation, but denial is something that stands apart and in terms of which the notion of negation is introduced. And so it so happens that the people who are mostly involved in bilateral semantics, namely Ian Rumford, Greg Restall, Hugh Price, and Graham Priest, they all happen to have something in common. They are deeply connected to the Antipodes, to Australia. So I think this is, more or less a reasonable facsimile of these four. And then the Pommy bastard is Timothy Smiley, and Timothy Smiley actually has the nice fighting faith, articulates the fighting faith of the bilateral semanticist. I treat assertion and rejection as distinct activities on all fours with one another, whereas assertion expresses assent to a proposition, rejection expresses dissent from that same proposition, in each case by means of a sentence whose sense is the proposition in question. Crack tubes. And so the one thing I'd like to suggest is that the thing that has gone unnoticed by commentators is that bilateral semantics, we had an early expression of bilateral semantics in Peirce when he moved from just a truth conditional, a truth conception of meaning, to this conception of meaning that involves not just assertion, but also denial. And so you might ask yourself, what is Peirce doing between 1902 and 1905? And what is the role of these articles, these monist articles, around 1905? And in it, I'm just going to gloss over this. What Peirce is trying to do is he's trying to give a logical proof or demonstration of the pragmatic maxim itself. Okay, he's trying to give something that he can. He's a great logician in his own way, and he's trying to, in using his own system of proof. We'll see some of that in just a little bit. He's trying to provide us with a logical proof for the truth of pragmatism, this account of meaning. And in order to do that, he switches from thinking in terms of the sensible effects of things. Okay, you know how the verificationist theory of meaning might be seen to founder, to be hosted by its own petard. You can't, in its own terms, you can't verify the verification theory of meaning. Here, Peirce is trying to give a logical proof of his theory of meaning, and so I would argue, in order to do it, that accounts in part for his shift from truth to that of, to articulating the maxim in terms of affirmation and denial. And so this is just, he's trying to articulate a proof for the pragmatic maxim. And so, that gets me wondering, and some of you I just saw, oh yeah, and again, Denver, bless its heart, or Colorado, Denver, bless its heart, already tends to do logic this way, and again, I applaud. What I was going to point out is that that articulation of the pragmatic maxim, it talks about spelling out the consequences of affirming a claim and spelling out the consequences, I should probably do it this way, spelling out the consequences of affirming a claim and spelling out the consequences of denying a claim. Well, them's of you who've taken logic from Mark, as wonderful. I don't know. Mark is someone I know. He was talking to me about this.
That's because I taught her.
Shut up. I don't care how it happened. But you've seen these bilateral, two-sided proof trees, where what are you doing? You are unpacking the consequences of affirming premises, and you're unpacking the consequences of denying a conclusion. And when I give this kind of talk to other people, they're more familiar with natural deduction style proofs. For those of you who don't know, who are, back in the Stone Age when we did other kinds of proof systems, a proof looked like this, where you put the conclusion at the bottom, you had the premises at the top, and you sort of work to fill in the middle, and it sucked. Okay, is what you do. But the two-sided, and it's actually a challenge, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the two-sided proof trees, as Mark and Candace will attest, these are easy peasy to teach and to master. And of course, the idea of what you're doing is you're trying to expose incompatibilities between patterns of affirmation and denial. And as I say, there's Alec Baldwin there. Always be closing. Always be closing. All right, and so again, I probably don't need to walk you through this as I would other audiences. But you've got your typical Tableau bilateral proof tree, and you're again working out the consequences of affirming premises and the consequences of denying a conclusion, all with the idea of trying to expose incompatibilities in these two attitudes, two sets of attitudes. Now, I don't know if Mark or Candace talk about this, but there is a nice correspondence between, say, those earlier natural deduction systems that are a pain in the butt. But nevertheless, there is a nice correlation between the left-hand rules for the bilateral proof trees and the elimination rules in for instance, a natural deduction system that uses Gensen rules. And there is a correlation between the right-hand rules for the two bilateral proof trees and the introduction rules. So for instance, if you think now what is if you're working up from a conclusion, and so you think, for instance, you're thinking you need to derive A ampersand B, A conjunction B. What do you need to do in order to derive A ampersand B? Well, you need to derive A, you need to derive B. When you decompose a bilateral proof tree, basically what you're doing is you're splitting up, you're giving yourself two new proofs, one in which, given all the collateral commitments that you already have, you need to now prove A as a goal and prove B as a goal. So the right-hand rules correspond, or at least this ampersand rule corresponds on the right, corresponds to the introduction rule for ampersand in your typical Fitch-style system. Perhaps it's a little more interesting. Think about what it is you need to do if you want a goal conditional. What do you need to do in a Fitch-style system? You make A available to yourself as an assumption, and then you try to derive B. What do you do when you decompose a conditional in a two-sided bilateral tree? In essence, you make A available to you, and you attempt to close off the possibility of denying B. Okay. Same thing is going on. Same thing is going on here on the other side, on the left-hand side. Suppose you have a conditional. What can you do with a conditional? Well, if only you were able to prove the antecedent, you can derive the consequent. What's going on here? Suppose you have an arrow available to you. Well, if only it were shown that you may not deny A, so A is a new goal, then you can make B available to you. So the same thing is going on. I'm not going to go through all those rules, that would be tedious, but generally the left-hand rules of the two bilateral tree system correspond to elimination rules, and the right-hand rules correspond to introduction rules. And that actually allows you, I love this, I love this little, I've used this for several different purposes. This, in effect, was the proof, the two-sided proof that you saw earlier. This is a corresponding natural deduction system using Fitch-style rules. And this actually, all these different arrows illustrate how the various decompositions here correspond to various moments in the Fitch-style proof. To the point that when I am forced to teach logic this way, using a Fitch system, I direct students to the trees, and they take trees and use trees as guides for the construction of the Fitch-style proof. Okay. There are some complications, especially with refutations and all that. All right. So the idea here, the idea that I was closing off with is, hey, look, these bilateral articulations of the pragmatic maxim. Now, those map very nicely onto bilateral tree proofs. And you can, okay, that's great. So what? here I'm going to turn to my dear old Dr. Fodder, and sort of answer in part that so what question. Why should we care about this? And hi Bob, this is my dear old Dr. Fodder, my PhD advisor. He has a piece that he's included in his perspectives on pragmatism. And he locates in the telling of the tale that leads up to him, he talks about the pragmatist tradition in a broad sweeping stroke, and he identifies 4 blind spots that the classical pragmatists miss. Now, all of you in David's course right now should take a look at these and judge for yourself whether the classical pragmatists, either in retail or in detail, miss these things. But according to Brandom, the pragmatists look slowly downstream to the consequences of affirming or believing a content or a claim, not to the antecedent circumstances that warrant such affirmations. They don't sufficiently distinguish the logical consequences belief bear upon other beliefs. Okay, don't talk about intralinguistic transitions enough. They ignore the distinctive role that desires play in the explanation of human action and set that one aside. And they conceive of truth conditions largely as success conditions. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah. In fact, Putnam did in 2002, and he never answered any of them.
Yes. And so I'm actually going. David sees this into the 4 blinds. Why are we even broadcasting this? I don't care. I actually think all 4 of these have been roundly trounced in the literature, and justly trounced in the literature. Sorry, Dad. And the Putnam piece in particular was just a takedown. Larry Hickman does a very good job of at least these 2 as well. And if you remember, the people who adopt that verificationist strand or emphasize that verificationist strand in the Pragmatic Maxim, okay, what is our idea of a thing? Well, it's perhaps largely exhausted by the effects of, specifically perhaps sensible effects of that thing. And you kind of go, what is Brandom talking about? So I think in the literature, this has been fairly and roundly trounced. However, what I am going to say is, even in Brandom's own terms, the interesting thing is Peirce's bilateral conception of the Pragmatic Maxim avoids this charge. And so focus on that first alleged blind spot. And so Brandom says here, that's his wife making fun of him. First, in thinking about the functional role of belief in reciprocal interactions and attunements between believers and their environments, the pragmatists look only downstream to the practical consequences of beliefs. That is to say, they look only at the roles of beliefs as premises in practical inferences. They don't also look upstream to the antecedents of beliefs, to the role as conclusions of inferences, or as the results of other processes of belief formation. And as Brandom further elaborates this objection, he says that the semantic projects of traditional empiricism, on the other hand, they look upstream but fail to look downstream. So the pragmatists, they look downstream, the traditional empiricists look only upstream, and each of these approaches, each of these one-sided approaches to semantics leaves out the crucial complementary aspect of the functional role of beliefs. Okay, one must look to both antecedents and to consequences. Now, what I want to suggest, what I want to suggest is we just saw that by including not just the consequences of affirming a claim, but also the consequences of denying a claim. Remember what the consequences of denying a claim, when we look back to the bilateral proof trees,
What did they correspond to? They corresponded to the introduction rules, what Brandom thinks of as the upstream claims that would lead one to conclude a concept, to conclude a certain claim. And so already this allying the pragmatic maxim with the bilateral proof trees shows that Peirce, by including the consequence of denials, avoids this charge that avoids the charge that Brandom levied. And the interesting thing is, does so kind of in Brandom's own terms, without, these are the articulations of the pragmatic maxim where Peirce justly says, I'm only looking to consequences, and I am not thinking about sensation at all. But by including the consequences of denial, he has also given himself that inferential space that Brandom thinks that he misses. Okay, so even on Brandom's own terms, sorry, Dad, Peirce has something interesting. It's kind of interesting. Brandom construes of a pragmatism that is centered around the Speech Act of Assertion, and he says that assertion is the downtown of any language game. If you're Peirce, you say not just of assertion, but denial has to belong in that downtown as well. All right, and so again, the more complete picture, I have had some stuff to say about that, but I kind of want to move on. And so let's go back, thinking about proof systems again. I think that, and I'm going to make a speculative claim, that Peirce would have embraced the two-sided proof trees. And in order to, it's a speculative claim, he, as far as I can tell, was not aware of the tree method of logical proof. What to say about that? But as evidence that Peirce would have embraced it, what I'd like you to do, this is a piece from 1885, Algebra of Logic. Don't be afraid here of logic. He's trying to axiomatize a system of logic. And his fifth axiom, kind of like Euclid's parallel postulate. Fifth axiom is what's come to be known as Peirce's law. It's x arrow y arrow x arrow x. Can't you see that that is just true? Okay, and the answer, it's like, and Peirce says, well, I understand. This is not patently, this is not like p arrow q arrow p. This is a little bit more complicated than the other axioms. I need to do a little bit more argumentation in order to show that this is an axiom. So he says, this is hardly axiomatic. That it is true appears as follows. It can only be false by the final consequent, x being false while it's antecedent. This is true, but if this is true, either its consequence x is true when the whole formula would be true, or its antecedent, that's the inner conditional, is false. But in the last case, the antecedent of x arrow y, that is x, must be true. Now, if you did not follow that, maybe this shows you exactly what's going on. What Peirce has done, and this is a repeat, and if you just follow this, what Peirce has done is just basically start here. Let's imagine this is false. If this is false, then this is true and that's false. If this is true, well then this is either false and that's true, but that's locked off. And if this is true, well then that's false and that's locked off. In other words, what Peirce does in his argument is just recapitulate a Tableau style proof of, in English of his own Peirce's law. All right, well, here's your Fitch-style counterpart in a natural deduction system of proof. I say natural deduction because if you look at this, this is not the way anybody would naturally deduce this. How would you naturally deduce this? you would do just what Peirce did, and you would give essentially a truth tree. Okay, so this is sort of like, this involves embedding. In fact, when you teach Fitch-style systems, you said you taught largely derivations?
No,
Oh, somebody taught derivations? Somebody, oh. Teaching the derivations, this is one of those classical problems to separate those with true mastery of the derivation system from the merely competent. This requires some thinking. If you want to do an an axiomatic proof of Peirce's law, using, of course, an axiom system that doesn't already have Peirce's law in it, this is what that might look like. And this was beyond my pay grade. I had to give this to my assistant, Jesse Fitz, a PhD now from the University of Massachusetts. He did this during some football game. Again, outside of my pay grade. And as you can see, not just 4 steps, but more than 4. All right. Well, you might ask yourself, what about Peirce's own diagrammatic system of logic? And this is Peirce's own system using his alpha graphs. Now, don't be afraid of this. The system is actually extremely easy. The circles just mean negations. And when you have 2 things like this conjoined with concatenated against one another, that's just a conjunction. Peirce's alpha graphs are just conjunctions and negations. Okay? And then the economy is born by the fact that that notation collapses a lot of distinctions that we make using other notations. But this is Peirce's own way of proving. Okay, so this is, wouldn't you see it? Don't you just see it? This is Peirce's law. It takes some practice seeing what this is. This inner thing right here, this basically means not A and not B. So not A and not B. Well, when is a conditional false? When the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. And so when is a conditional true? When you have not the antecedent and the consequent. And so this right here is that inner conditional of Peirce's law. Okay? We don't need to go into the details there. But I was just pointing out that even Peirce's law requires a certain bit of ingenuity, especially in figuring out what to insert into the graphs in order to preserve, so to speak, truth. But I told you, Peirce's graphs are just conjunctions and negations. And so you can adapt the 2 bilateral tree rules to Peirce's own notation. And so this is again in Peirce's notation, his law, and this is just this is just a negation on the right. Flip it over, then this is just a conjunction of these 2 things on the left. Decouple those. This is, well, we're going to apply the negation rule to this. That's what you got right here. This is a conjunction. What do you do with a conjunction on the right? Split the path. And there you have a bilateral tree proof using Peirce's own notation. And it also corresponds roughly with Peirce's I would say corresponds more closely to Peirce's justification for his own. And so, nice, we're on to the very last, thanks for your patience. We're on to the very last bit, and yeah, here's the cutie again. Question arises then, where do proof trees come from? Where does this Tableau system of logic come from? And the first textbook to use it extensively is Richard Jeffrey, Formal Logic, Its Scope and Limits, published in 1967. The system itself derives from a couple of logicians, E.W. Beth and, in its first order incarnation, Jaakko Hintikka in the 1950s. You know, so in fact, E.W. Beth calls it, well, it was called Beth Tableau after the method was called the method, Beth's Tableau method, and that's how we got the name Tableau to begin with. Raymond Smulyan, the Tableau method also had two sides. It also had tags for truth and falsity as well. Raymond Smulyan was the person who first thought of the idea of, well, let's collapse this all onto one tree, and, one side, and what we do is we negate the conclusion and then work out the consequences there. And I think that's a terrible, terrible move because it covers up, it makes some commitments about negation that you might not, especially if you're interested in non-classical logic, you might not want to make. But nevertheless, Richard Jeffrey uses this, and it's probably the tree system, the kind of tree system that one encounters most frequently in texts. I don't know of any texts with the bilateral trees at all.
Nope, never seen it.
Never
The
seen
only
it.
I've ever seen is this guy.
Yeah. Wait, yeah, is this guy, is this the only text you've seen?
No, I mean, it appears in, so Priest, as you know, uses it extensively in his
That's right.
classical book.
And so Colin Hauser is Logic with Trees, but anyway. So we got the first text in 1967, we get Hintika and Beth in the 1950s, and by most accounts, hey, this is where the tree system started. But that's not exactly right. Let's dig deeper. Hi, Sig. And we're going to find out, if you trace the method of trees to what I think of as its source, you encounter this guy. Anybody recognize who this is? Poet, photographer, logician. That's a famous poem, and it's an acrostic. If you look at, you know, what are the first letters of them? Alice Liddell. Who is Alice Liddell? Now, and so who are we talking about, of course? We're talking about Lewis Carroll. Okay, Lewis Carroll was now 1950s when Tableau was developed by Hintika and Beth, and then texted by Richard Jeffries. That's well past Peirce's death. But Lewis Carroll was a Peirce contemporary. And so, and here, just sort of, he wrote, of course, Symbolic Logic and the Game of Logic, but he also wrote a second volume of Symbolic Logic. Let me tell you a little bit about that second volume. It was, I think, 1894, so again, well within Peirce's lifetime, well when Peirce is thinking about logical diagrams. Lewis Carroll, who also is interested in simplifying the pedagogy of logic, trying to get logic to be taught as simply as possible, so you can teach it to the little ones. I almost said little girls, but you want to teach it to the younger ones. He was compiling a volume 2 of his Symbolic Logic, and in his diary in 1894, he writes, "Today has proved to be an epoch in my logical work." This is Lewis Carroll, the White Knight. "It occurred to me to try a complex Sorites kind of logical problem by the method I've been using for ascertaining what sells." Talks about his game of logic. "I took one with many premises. It came out beautifully, the method, and much shorter than the method I've used hitherto. I think of calling it the genealogical method. Eventually, in Symbolic Logic Part 2, the genealogical method, he now is called the method of trees." He writes here, "In the method of trees, this process is reversed. Its essential feature is that it involves a reductio ad absurdum. That is, we begin by assuming, for the sake of argument, that the aggregate of the retinans." Okay, now that's a bunch of logical hoo-ha. So basically, what we do is we think of some item, an entity, we imagine item to have a certain constellation of attributes and non-attributes, and then we systematically apply premises to that item, and then we work out whether that eventually exposes contradictions. The item having an attribute and its non-attribute at once, or an attribute being asserted, of a kind being asserted to exist or not asserted to exist. And sometimes when working out the premises, as we'll see in a minute here, in working out the premises, you have to think about different possible constellations of attributes, different combinations of attributes. And so, instead of just working down, well, you'll have to branch out and then apply different premises in order to work out. Now, these dots here, this diagram, you don't have the premises. It's not going to make sense. This is actually Carroll's notation, where we have something, K and C here. The marks here says it's not a K and it's not a C. It's a kind of item, and yeah, it has Z and D, but now it's also has to have not T, and then we work on further. And these are his closing marks, and it goes on. But the point is, this begins to look like an ancestor to our method of trees. And so that gives us kind of a question. We know from the Lewis Carroll Volume 2, Lewis Carroll cites Peirce's studies in logic. Okay, he was well aware of some of the diagrammatic techniques that Peirce and his students at Johns Hopkins were developing for logic. But the question is, how about the other way around? Was Peirce familiar with the work of Lewis Carroll? And unfortunately, from what we can tell, the answer is no. And in fact, if you think about what Peirce has to say about over-cultivated Oxford dons, or what one of the Bruces might have called stuck-up sticky beaks, the familiarity probably did not go the other way around. Now, I'll just close with, this is unfortunate, I think, because had Peirce been aware of the diagrammatic techniques that Lewis Carroll was developing at the same time, then I think both logic and pragmatism itself would have taken, I think, a different, more pictorial, more diagrammatic, and, well, I think perhaps even a healthier turn. I'm going to close at that, but maybe in questions and answers, I'll tell you the story about Lewis Carroll's Volume 2 of Symbolic Logic. So that'll be it.
We have plenty of time for questions.
I tried to keep it right at an hour. I could have, unfortunately, I could just subject you to some of these things forever.
Do you want to field your own questions? Or
If people are well behaved, I can feel things.
If it gets sticky.
Okay.
let me know.
Yeah. Okay. Help, Dave.
No. So I just wanted to ask about raising this idea of bilateral semantics. It strikes me that there was another early source that has a similar discussion, but it's not bilateral, it's multilateral. This is Strawson on predicates, where he's talking about predicate structure are always laid out as contrast classes, right? And Millikan, for example, makes much of this later on. But Strawson goes on that if you're going to understand red, understanding red is to understand the way in which red stands opposed to blue, yellow, and green. But it's not to understand things as red and not red. There's a fleshed out color contrast.
What you might call determinate negation, which you might think of in terms of Hegel's inverted world.
I hadn't thought that.
That's where I was going to go. Okay, go ahead.
No, well, this is why I was raising this. It strikes me that this is another kind of move that we saw earlier. Strawson. I mean, I don't know if anybody read this book. because it was a little book that he wrote on the logic of predicate structure, but it didn't seem like it ever got cited. But this is where he laid out this idea that to understand the logic of predication is to understand the logic of these contrast classes. And that's what separates off the predicate from the traditional Aristotelian substance, which there is no contrast to. And out of that, you would build negation, which is kind of what you were talking about, right? That you would have, by having the both affirmation and denial, from that you would build negation.
Mm-hmm. There's another, so when is this Strawson piece? This is probably
This is going to
late
be like
40s, early 50s?
yeah, somewhere like late.
This is
50s.
what happens when analytic philosophers do history of philosophy. We don't get things, we never...
I don't know when anything happened.
Yeah.
I know I have a little teeny book that I got from the University of Hong Kong as a leftover used book for $1. That's all I know about it. And it has that good sitting in too long in the library smell. No, I was just asking if this was part of that same story, because...
Well, I can give you some other, I'm happy to hear, I'm happy to get this pointer. I'm grateful for it. There are some other sources. Now, Peirce is doing this in 1904, 1905. In 1925, 1926, Frank Ramsey tells the bilateralist's story about negation. That Frank Ramsey it's a piece, an article called Facts and Propositions, widely known, but in Facts and Propositions, Ramsey is trying to say, oh no, Mr. Russell, you don't need negative facts. You don't need negative facts. The notion of a negation is constructed out of a prior notion of denial. And so that story does get, that's a Ramsey story. Maybe that's where Strawson.
That would make more sense.
That would make more sense, is that Strawson gets it through Ramsey. By the way, I'll also point out that Frank Ramsey, in that same piece, the very last paragraph, he says, I'm a pragmatist, and I take my inspiration for pragmatism from Mr. Russell. Okay, and you kind of,
Russell says, go ahead.
he said, but I'm a pragmatist. I take my inspiration for pragmatism from Mr. Russell. I take the core pragmatist insight to be that the content of a claim is to be understood in terms of the consequences of affirming the claim. And so, you get here a direct link between. Now he doesn't go double-barreled like Peirce does, but and he adds a little bit more as he talks about that a little bit more. But Frank Ramsey is clearly picking up something that you see in Peirce in those articulations, and not spelling out meaning in terms of consequences of a claim's being true, but in terms of the consequence of affirming. Cheryl Musak misses that completely in her Cambridge Pragmatism book. Did I answer you at all? Or I just told a different story altogether?
I don't know how so much I had. I was just throwing out this thing that
Yeah,
came
no,
up when you were doing it. So
but-
this was
but-
all good information.
But it's right, is that, there is a story, a bilateral story of denial as being more fundamental than negation, that certainly gets picked up by Ramsey when he tries to tell Mr. Russell that the function of a negation is to express a denial, and the negation does not map out into something in the world that you would think of as a negative fact.
Right.
Okay, so for the slow, you said that Peirce was trying to give a proof for the truth of the pragmatic maxim. And so now I need to have that cashed out in terms of what do we care, what conception of truth are we talking about? Why do we
Well,
Why do we care about
there
truth?
is no truth, there's
Well, you-
proof.
Oh, well, I
yeah.
put that in there, I
Proof of
see,
the-
okay, proof of the I see. And so that's in terms of, affirming and denying and, okay, I understand.
I will tell you, well, I'll tell you a story kind of to follow that up. These 1905 monist, these articles that appear in the monist, Peirce promises a proof of the maxim of pragmatism. But he never gives it. What he does is he then gives another article outlining his notation system, his existential graphs, and his system of permissions, transformations between those existential graphs. And then he promises again a proof of pragmatism, and it never comes. And in fact, Peirce abandons that project subsequently in 1907 and 1908. He then tries to give a justification for pragmatism based more generally on his theory of semiotics and signs, on firstness, secondness, thirdness.
Yeah.
Okay, and that a rabbit hole that I will not go down. But you know, there's this point in time where Peirce seems to think that he can give a completely formal proof of the pragmatic maxim. We don't really know how that goes, or was supposed to go. It is a cottage industry amongst the Peirceans, especially those that play with the existential graphs, as to how that proof was supposed to go. My suggestion here, and it's only a suggestion, is the bilateral tree system embodies the expression of the pragmatic maxim much better than his own system involving the existential graphs. And so if Peirce had available to him that bilateral tree method, or a more bilateral method, then he might have stuck with the idea of trying to give a wholly logical proof of the pragmatic maxim a little longer, and might not have abandoned that in 1907, 1908.
Oh, well, that makes.
But, by the way, but that is all, yeah, it's a pattern of sensibility, and it's completely who knows what Peirce would have done with the method of trees. I know that, Peirce probably, anything that Lewis Carroll would have come up with, he might have dismissed out of hand. And there were bits of Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll was he was a category logician, and so he thought, among other things, that universal claims carried existential import, and that was, Peirce would have no truck with that. But that actually, that little piece of Lewis Carroll logic isn't central to his method of trees. You can step away from that and still take the method of trees.
So now can you tell us the story of the second?
Well, I'll have a...
So here again is another sort of backing up kind of question. So you started off by talking about the different pragmatic maxims. So the first one, the meaning of a term is cashed out in terms of its sensible effects, right? And the second one, the meaning of a term is cashed out in terms of the consequences of what would happen if that was true. And then in the third one, the meaning of a term or phrase is cashed out in terms of affirming or denying.
Consequences of affirming.
Affirming or denying that claim.
Yeah.
And that last one is what you call the conduct strand, right?
I call it, yeah.
You call it the conduct strand. Now, a lot of people think, what I find a lot of people like about pragmatism is that conduct is not just logical conduct and the asserting and denying of claims and trees and all that sort of stuff. So what I want to understand is, are you thinking that third formulation of the pragmatic maxim, Peirce was in a way saying, really what pragmatism comes down to is the affirming or denying of logical claims and that sort of thing? Or are you saying that here's a way to trace out from Peirce a kind of logical system which develops from it, but Peirce didn't have a theory of conduct or a conception of conduct that was as narrow as what maybe, semanticists or logicians have today. So what are you saying about Peirce?
So there's nothing. So there's nothing. There's nothing here in the sort of giving you the complete story here. There's nothing here that rules that means that these transitions from this claim, for instance, to this claim needs to be formally correct or logical. Okay. In fact, you actually might make explicit this material correctness in logical vocabulary. So there's nothing here that the base here, I'm limiting it to, so to speak, the conduct of making logically correct inferences. And I'm not, and again, this picture here is explicit that it's not just intra-language transitions, but there's also the language exit transitions. So here we get conduct more generally. Oh, pickles now, and start hacking, or hey Fluffy, and this is also conduct as well. Which is what we do when we teach a child, how to deploy observation vocabulary. That's red. Oh, Johnny, that's black. And you instill in them habits of calling things, of pointing out conditions as they are. So I am thinking here, yes, in the logical system that we have there on the paper, that's conduct very narrowly, but I mean the conduct to be much broader.
Okay, well, you just mentioned habits, and we've got the final formulation was the character remaining consistent in the implications and non-implications of the words, so that gets a kind of inferentialism, right? As you pointed out rightly, if you're into a kind of inferentialism, there's now a kind of normativity. Normativity and habits don't walk together easily. So the question then is obvious, where is Peirce getting his normativity?
Yeah.
Right? Because otherwise what we just have is the game of habits, which might be fine to some degree as long as we don't want to then say of someone, that inference was incorrect. Right? Or
That's a
you are
story
wrong to
that-
say of that it's intentional.
It's a story that Peirce doesn't really tell.
Okay.
I mean, Peirce is quiet on it. I think that we have to wait for Sellers to make that, to complete that story. But there's some interesting chapters in Dewey that take us some of the way there. But Peirce is pretty quiet about it.
Well, I didn't want to mention Sellers because obviously Sellers is spending lots of time on that issue, but that's why I wanted to raise that Peirce already has some antecedent idea taking place.
Not that I can tell. Nothing really sophisticated. What we have is he certainly wants activity. He wants what he calls self-controlled conduct, and there are some rules and correctness and ideas of correctness and incorrectness behind that. And he's interested in what he calls the normative sciences, logic being the primary normative science. But does he give an account of how the habits come to be? Frankly, he is disappointingly individualistic about this question. And I think, again, we have to wait for Dewey, maybe Mead, I don't know. And it gets its full power later. What's that? Oh, this. Okay. By the way, the story of Symbolic Logic, Volume 2. So, Lewis Carroll. He comes up with this method of trees, it's an epic, as he says, in his development of logic. That's in 1894. He's frantically putting together, adding the method of trees to volume 2 of his Symbolic Logic. He finishes that. The chapters of volume 2 of Symbolic Logic go into galley proof stages, okay? And they are sent out to reviewers to comment on. And then Lewis Carroll has the audacity to die in 1896. And a lot of those galley proofs were sent back to Carroll's office in Oxford. But in fine Oxford fashion, when a Don dies, we just sweep up the rubbish and burn it all. And so Carroll's stuff was largely lost. A lot of his notes were, most of his notes on logic were lost. It takes, if I go back, boom, 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 boom. This guy, William Warren Bartley, in the late 60s and in the 70s, he takes it upon himself to try to reconstruct volume 2 of Lewis Carroll's Symbolic Logic. And you imagine what happens with the Carroll Archives. There's lots of Carrolliana. Okay, but who's collecting Lewis Carroll stuff? People who are interested in children's literature. And so logical stuff, logical correspondences are being sent to specialists in children's literature. And they see this stuff, and they throw it in the back of the file. And so there's some very large Carroll archives, but they're all, of course, largely focused on Sylvia and Bruno, Alice in Wonderland, and so on. And then all these places have a file for that stuff. And bless his heart, Bartley goes to the Carroll archives, various Carroll archives. Among others, the library in Pasadena, the Huntington, yes, and was able to, from a variety of archives, reconstruct Lewis Carroll's Symbolic Logic, Volume 2, because some of the folks who had received, including the chapter on the method of trees in its entirety, some of the people who had received these proofs for Lewis Carroll's method of trees were lazy and didn't review it promptly. And so, so this is, let this be a lesson. Procrastination can pay. And so, while it was mostly thought that all of Volume 2 was lost to the dustbins of history, Bartley was able to recover it. And this thing, Lewis Carroll's Volume 2 of Symbolic Logic, only comes out in 1979. And so, Lewis Carroll's method of trees was lost to history from 1894 to the 1970s. Again, if only. If only Peirce might have been talking more to Oxford logicians, those Aristotelians. We might have seen a different style of not only logical pedagogy, but we might have seen some interesting different notational distinctions as well.
And you wouldn't suffer as much, Dave.
And you might not have suffered so
I'm
much.
all for that.
One of the things that I really applaud the way Mark and Candace are teaching logic, because I think there's a lot of needless suffering in the establishing of various, whether or not various sequence are formally correct. And not only that method of trees also, not only is it a proof method, it's also a counterfactual finding method. And the Fitch-style derivation systems, they don't do that. They don't, and so among other things, it makes the meta theory of trees a lot easier. And again, there's just so much pointless suffering in the instruction of logic. Let's end the suffering. That's my, I think that's my, my ending is let's end the suffering.
Let's end the suffering.
I speak for the trees.
Sweet. Thank you. And while there are refreshments outside, feel free to hang around and chat with Dave or any of us and enjoy something to eat.
Yeah,
I just learned about
me too.
Yeah.
Oh.
I see what you're up to.